Before we jump into this week's episode of the Major Pain Podcast, I will remind you that I am not a medical professional. Please do not take any medical action based off what you hear on this podcast without first consulting your doctor. I'll also say that if you are enjoying Major Pain, we would love your support to keep the show going. There are several great ways to do so. The first is our ongoing Patreon campaign. Through Patreon, you can subscribe with monthly financial contributions that directly support this show's creation. We have 3 tiers of support: the $2 per month supporter tier, $7 per month patron tier, and $25 per month producer tier. Each tier comes with different levels of recognition on the podcast itself and gifts when you sign up. Our $7 per month patrons will receive a gift of a Major Pain coaster, and our $25 per month producers receive a Major Pain tote bag, both gifts made by my mom. Everyone who signs up on Patreon will gain access to monthly bonus episodes with myself and my partner Andy, where we talk about what's going on in our lives, updates on our health, and the movies and TV and books we are currently enjoying. You can learn more about our Patreon campaign and sign up to support this podcast at patreon.com/majorpainpodcast. Extra special thank you to our Patreon producers supporting this show at the highest tier of $25 per month: Steve Kavanaugh, Chris Fowler, Trish O'Brien, and Hipster Leia. Other great ways to support this podcast include clicking our affiliate links, which you can find in the show notes of this and every episode. That includes Rare Patient Voice, an amazing program where you can be paid for your time to participate in research studies and surveys. If you have a diagnosis of any kind or you are a caregiver, you qualify to participate in Rare Patient Voice. Sign up using our link, rarepatientvoice.com/majorpainpodcast. And if you participate in a research study or survey, you will earn an average of $120 per hour for your time. You can also support this show when you sign up for NeuroHealth. NeuroHealth is an online headache and neurology clinic where you can get the care you deserve without the wait. Head to neurohealth.co/majorpain to get a discount and support this podcast when you sign up. Or you can head to our Amazon shop, amazon.com/shop/majorpainpodcast. Our shop features products that I use to manage my chronic illness, and Major Pain will earn a commission on any purchases from this shop. Or you can start any Amazon shopping trip from our shop, go on to Amazon, purchase anything at all, and this podcast will still earn a commission. Follow Major Pain on social media. We are on TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, and Facebook, all at Major Pain Podcast, where you can leave a comment on any episode and interact with other listeners of our growing community. And of course, don't forget to leave Major Pain a positive rating and review wherever you get your podcasts. We are on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and most major podcast platforms. This show is intended as a free resource for anyone going through chronic illness and disability, to build community around experiences often lived in isolation, to break down the layers of societal ableism, and to help you navigate for your own personal health equity, and also just have a lot of fun. Thank you for checking out the Major Pain Podcast. Let's get to today's episode.
How lucky it is just to get through a day without pain.
If you look at me, it doesn't appear that I have a disability.
A test that comes back abnormal, it's like, yes, we're onto something here.
Welcome to Major Pain. I'm your host, Jesse Mercury, and this week I'm so excited to be joined by Sarah from the Rough Edges podcast. Sarah, welcome to Major Pain.
Thank you for having me.
I'm so excited to talk to you today. The email that you sent to kind of connect us got me so interested in your story and so excited to have you on the show. But before we get into that, let's get to know you a little bit. So Sarah, why don't you tell us about yourself?
Yes, so once again, my name is Sarah Fox, and I am a mental health advocate who is passionate about teaching others how to embrace hope in a world that says otherwise. I was born and raised in Brooklyn, New York, and I recently got my master's in forensic psychology from Liberty University, and I also got my BA in politics, philosophy, and economics from the King's College.
Wow.
And in addition to that, I currently work as a case manager in supervised release in Brooklyn. So I work with a lot of justice-involved individuals, and I just love getting to help them and support them in their journeys and moving past their own criminal histories. And I'm also the host of the Rough Edges podcast, which is a mental health podcast that gives tools for mental health education, and also it examines the intersection between faith and mental illness. And on there, I also share a lot about how my faith journey informs my own mental health journey, and I get to spread hope and encouragement to others who listen. And I also love spoken word and performing spoken word, writing poetry, and I love exotic foods because I'm a foodie. And growing up in New York, you get a lot of variety with that. So I love to explore different food options as well.
Wow, amazing. What's your favorite type of food?
Ooh, okay. I really love just like seafood. So
Mm.
I'm really into like the shrimp and the lobster, and I love like seafood boils. So that's like where everything comes together and you get the Cajun seasoning and just like the potatoes, corn, and all the other seafood mixed together. That's like my favorite type of thing.
Awesome. Yeah. And did you say forensic psychology? Can you tell me more about that? What is that?
Yes, so forensic psychology is more of like an umbrella term for really understanding why criminals do what they do, and it's really understanding the psychology behind criminal activity and what would like motivate or, get a person to engage in those activities. And a forensic psychologist also does like a lot of mental health assessments for the courts. So um their assessments really help the court determine what is the next proper course of like action for them. So some of like offenders might need mental health services, others might need more harsher punishments, some might need parole, some might need incarceration. And so doing those mental health assessments could help like the courts and also private investigators and attorneys really understand the mind and the inner workings of a justice involved person.
Wow, fascinating. And where do you hope that all of this is leading you towards? What career are you wanting to get into?
Yes, so I want to be a forensic psychologist myself, and I also want to lean more towards social services in terms of like not only assessing offenders, but also giving them the resources that they need to reduce recidivism and make sure that they do not continue on this path, but to have a better life in the future. And so I want to get my PhD in clinical psychology so that way I could have maybe my own practice in the future and get to really work with the justice system so that way we can have people who can not only better themselves in life, but have a transformational aspect as well.
Wow, fascinating. Well, I'm really excited to hear a bit more about your activism and what you said right at the beginning about how you like to help people find hope. We're living in a day and age where that's very important right now, so I definitely hope that we learn more about that as well as we go through your story. But I'm so curious how mental health has impacted your story. So, Sarah, what is your major pain?
That's a great question. My major pain is definitely bipolar disorder. So in January of 2021, I experienced a severe manic episode,
Mm,
which involved me having a lack of like a need for sleep at first. So I wasn't really sleeping. And it started off with me talking very rapidly. Like most of my thoughts were incoherent. And I was also in this euphoric state
mm.
where I felt on top of the world. I felt untouchable. And I wasn't really in touch with reality. And another element of my manic episode was psychosis. So during that time, I was seeing things, I was hearing things that weren't actually there, and I was just having a lot of hallucinations to the point where I became aggressive. And that's when my family decided that the right course of action would be to have me hospitalized. And from that, I went to the hospital and I spent like almost 3 weeks there because they were trying to assess like what was going on. I was explaining the manic episode to them. My mother was also explaining what was going on, from her point of view. And so they diagnosed me with bipolar disorder. And when I got that diagnosis, my world was just crushed. I
Mm.
didn't know anything about bipolar disorder really at that point. I was just beholden to the negative connotations that surrounded bipolar disorder. Like people would say, oh, the weather is so bipolar because it went from sunny to rainy. Or people would say, hey, if you have a change in mood, you might be bipolar. So that was my context for bipolar disorder. And so, me receiving that diagnosis, there were a lot of things going through my mind. And I had a huge identity crisis in that moment because now I had to recontextualize everything that I ever thought about myself and also life going forward. I knew that life was going to look different for me because I had to manage this mental health condition. And so my major pain was definitely receiving that diagnosis because it not only made me realize that I needed to take care of my mental health more, because at that point, my mental health was at the back burner. Like, I was in college, I had recently graduated at that point, so I was trying to go forward with my career, and this just put everything at a standstill. And so, having to grapple with all of that, it was a very depressing experience in the beginning because not only do I have to figure out what the rest of my life is going to look like, I now have to do it while managing this mental health condition. And that also put a lot of things into question with my faith because I come from a Christian background. And so up until that point, I was believing that faith was just the answer to everything, and I could just pray and read the Bible and go to church, and everything would be fine. But when something like that happens, it really tests your faith to a point where you're like, okay, I believe all these things, but now I'm experiencing life in a different way. What is going on? God, why did you let this happen? And so many of those questions were running through my mind. I was able to reconnect with my faith in a way that brought me not only hope, but a way to encourage others in their own mental health journeys as well.
Wow, that's so powerful. I, so, okay, this was like 4 years ago, almost exactly 4 years ago. Do you mind
Yes.
sharing how old you are now?
Yes, I am 26 now.
Okay, so you're like 22 years old, you're in college, and all of a sudden you have this intense manic episode. In the midst of it, what were you thinking was happening? You must have been terrified when it first started, or maybe not. I mean, maybe if you're in this feeling of euphoria, you feel great. I mean, what was your awareness of what was happening while it was happening?
Yes, that's an excellent question. So, in the beginning, I did feel very happy because not only was I feeling euphoric and untouchable, I was doing a lot of different things. I had a lot of different ideas running through my head. Like, I was outlining like my 10-year plan. I'm like, I'm gonna do this and this. And then I was also trying to write a memoir at one point. Like, I was just writing a bunch of drafts. And so, there were a lot of things going on in terms of like my creativity. And I felt like my mind was expanding. I felt like a genius. And so I felt like this was a good thing. But then at the time I lived with my mom and my sister, and they were looking at me like, what is going on? Because you are just on the go. Like you're nonstop. And I was also talking really fast. But to me, I wasn't talking really fast. I was just telling people about my great ideas and what I'm going to do in the future. But my family was like, hey, Sarah, you are incoherent. Like you're starting sentences and you're not finishing them and you're moving on to different things. So at first, I thought they were like, they just don't appreciate my genius.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to move on. But as it slowly got to the psychosis part of it, that's the point where I blacked out for a lot of it.
Mm.
And right before getting into that point, I was just very irritable. And I also was terrified because I didn't really know what was happening at that point. And to me, I'm like hallucinating. There are different, like, I'm seeing like different creatures, people, I'm hearing things. And I'm just like, what is going on? I don't know. So it was like a lot of confusion. It was a lot of terror on my end. And especially for my family, like, they were terrified too. Because at that point, they didn't really know what was going on either.
Yeah, wow. Once you got diagnosed with bipolar and you start to learn about it, what is bipolar?
Yes, so bipolar is a mood disorder that takes on a variety of different forms. So there are like three types of it. So I have bipolar type 1, which is categorized by the severity of your manic experience. And so the way that it was explained to me in the hospital was that the manic episode that I experienced was so severe that it falled under the first category. Bipolar type 2 is a little bit more like cyclical. So it's like you get into like hypomanic stages where it fluctuates a little bit more than bipolar type 1. So for me, if I'm in like a manic state, I am in it for a longer period of time. So it will be like a little bit of like maybe a couple of months where I feel
Wow.
that same type of happiness and general production. But then with like a depressive mode, like I would stay in that for a couple of months too, to the point where I would either have to call my psychiatrist and say, hey, I'm still feeling like very low, like what's going on? And then we would come up with a treatment plan for that. Bipolar disorder is also a mental health condition that really thrives on sleep. So the amount of sleep that I get at night could really dictate how my mood is going to be throughout the day. So for me, if I don't get enough sleep at night, I start off feeling that, okay, it's a new day, like I'm really productive. But then by that afternoon time, it dips a little bit and I feel very lethargic, very, a little bit depressive or irritable. So you really want to make sure that you guard your sleep and have an effective sleep routine because this is a disease that really thrives on like your sleep and circadian rhythm. And another aspect of bipolar disorder is making sure that you really stay on top of your treatment plan. Because I know for me, if I don't take my medication, I will have those moments where the moods like kind of fluctuate a little bit quicker. And this is like, just my experience. Other people may experience this differently, but I need to stay on top of my treatment plan. Otherwise, I will go from being irritable and depressive to being on that high where I'm like very productive and then it gets to a point of me being manic again. So it's really like a cyclical condition.
Yeah. So for you personally, there's the mania states, the manic states, and then the depressive states. And then what happens in between? Do you have a mixed state? Is there a baseline that feels like this is my normal and where I'm not in either of those states?
Yeah, so I do have a mixed state, and that usually looks like me like experiencing the sadness and the irritation, but not in such an extreme where it incapacitates me completely. So I'll give you an example. A normal for me is more of like if I feel sad about something or something irritates me, I'm able to just be like, you know what? Let me process this and then move forward. But if I'm in a depressive state, those thoughts will ruminate and then it will continue to impact my mood to the point where I'm feeling very depressed, very low, to the point where I don't want to do my normal activities, to the point where I want to stay in bed for a longer period of time. Like, it would result in me also isolating because I'm the type of person that if I'm going through something really, really significant or really tragic, I'm isolating myself from others. So when I get to those stages, I know, okay, this is not good for me. And it's same thing with the mania. Like, if I am really, really excited to the point where I'm not calming down and I'm still in that state where I'm like, okay, I'm on top of the world. I feel like I could conquer anything. Or I get to a point where I feel like I don't need to sleep or I don't need sleep at one point. Then that's how I know that I'm getting into a manic state. And another aspect of me understanding when I'm switching in between those two modes is like irritability. And that's another thing that doesn't get talked about as often in bipolar, just like the levels of anger that you could feel. So for me, if I'm like constantly irritated by the slightest of things, I'm talking about maybe a paper could drop from me and I'm just like getting all riled up, that's when I know, okay, I need to take a step back and really reassess and maybe try to temper this a little bit. Because for me, when I get very irritable, that's when I know that, okay, I'm probably at a manic state. I need to come back down a little bit.
Wow. I know you mentioned that in your initial experience with this disease, when you had psychosis, you sort of blacked out for a lot of it. What do you remember of that? I mean, I'm curious, if you can describe any of the hallucinations that you saw, if you remember any of them.
Yes. So with the psychosis, I was seeing a lot of things that really scared me. And a lot of them had to do with like creatures and like different like scary things for me. And also a lot of the voices that I heard were just like negative things, like about me specifically. Like, oh, you'll never make it past this, or you're never gonna see the future, or, just a lot of also suicidal type of voices that I was hearing.
Hmm.
So it was really like a negative like type of
Yeah.
feeling. And it was very overwhelming because at some point I knew it wasn't me thinking these things.
Hmm.
And it just felt like, okay, what is happening? Where is this all coming from? So there was that part of it. And another part was me being very aggressive. Because, like I said before, the anger is something that is not often talked about in bipolar because we don't want to perpetuate a stigma. But I think it's really important to understand how anger could play a role in bipolar disorder. And for me, at that point, I was very angry to the point where I was yelling at my family, like being very vulgar at them, like cursing at them, and just, saying a lot of hurtful things to them as well. And the aggression got to the point where I was actually getting physical, to the point where they were like, okay, we need to have outside help now because it's getting to a point where you're just lashing out and you're not really understanding what's happening as you're lashing out. So that was really like the point where I remembered like getting to the hospital, but then while I was in the hospital, I woke up and I was like, okay, why am I here? Like,
Oh,
what's going on?
wow.
Yeah, like I was just very scared and confused to the point where I was like, okay, I know I was like acting very strange like before, but how did I get here? And so that's what I meant by like I blacked out for most of it to the point where I was confused when I woke up in the hospital.
Wow. I mean, these voices sound terrifying. Is the voice, is it your own inner voice? Is it an external voice? I mean, is it someone else? Is it an imaginary voice?
So for me, it felt like it was external because I was hearing it like just like how I'm hearing you now.
Yeah.
That's how I was hearing it. But for me, I was like, wait a minute, this can't be because of the things that they were saying. So they were saying like terrible things about me and things like, oh, like you're going to die by the end of this. Like, just
Wow.
horrible terrible things. But it's like I knew it wasn't me because I'm like, I wouldn't say this. My inner voice doesn't sound like this.
Hmm.
So it was more of like, okay, I'm hearing like it's like people are talking to me, but I'm not seeing anyone. It's just like the voices are just popping up. So that's where it became like very terrifying for me because not only did I not see the source of where these voices were coming from, I was also hearing terrible things about myself that I'm like, okay, this can't possibly be me. Because you know what your inner dialogue sounds like, even when you're getting down on yourself, like, how you sound. So that's how I knew that something really wrong was happening here
Yeah.
because I'm hearing other things that don't sound like me and voices that are just saying very terrifying things to me, but they sounded like they were coming from outside, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And it sounds like, just following your own logic, I hear a voice, I don't see someone. It sounds like there is a part of you that recognizes, well, that's not lining up. That may not be real.
Right.
Yeah. And what about the creatures? Are they imaginary creatures? Are they real life creatures that you are seeing in places they aren't?
The thing about it is, it's like, it's hard to describe because unless I like draw it out for you or what they look like, but it kind of looked like, like horror films where they have like the demonic presence, and
Mm.
it's just like the spirits like, crawling around and
Oh,
like,
wow.
doing weird things. Those were things that I was seeing. And
Wow.
at one point I was just like, oh my gosh, I'm seeing like, this creature and stuff, and my family's looking at me like, what is going on? Like, we don't see, what are you talking about? So having my family there really helped me realize that what I was experiencing was not normal. Because if I was alone, like seeing all of these things and hearing all of these things, it would get very overwhelming to the point where I'm like, oh my gosh, is this real? Is it not? Like, but since I had people around me that were able to be like, Sarah, what are you talking about? Like, don't, I don't see anything. I don't hear anything. What is happening? So having that helped me to be able to recontextualize in my head, like, okay, something really wrong is happening or something out of the ordinary is happening to me. So I'm grateful that I was surrounded by my family at the time when this was going on.
Wow. Yeah. And I really appreciate you answering all these questions about the specifics because it really helps me to, understand what you were going through, the sights, the sounds, the feeling of being in that moment of not understanding what's happening and experiencing this altered reality. It's really, really interesting. I really appreciate you sharing that. So once you get to the hospital and you spend 3 weeks in the hospital, what are those initial 3 weeks like? What sort of care are you receiving for this sort of experience?
Yes. So I would say the first couple of weeks were more of like a trial and error type thing where I would sit in front of like doctors, sometimes one, but then it would be like one time it was like a panel, like a group of doctors, and they were all asking me questions about my experience. And so they were like, "Hey, what did you see?" Or what were some things like what were the voices that you were hearing? So similar to how you were asking me just now, they were
Mm.
asking me to describe what was going on. And I kept telling them, like, this is what I was experiencing, but I don't remember all of the specifics, but this is what I remember coming in here. Because again, it's like at a certain point, I didn't really know what was happening. After I spoke to the doctors about what had happened to me, they were explaining like what the symptoms sounded like. And then they're like, we're gonna come to a final decision about your diagnosis, but we are thinking that it's some type of like psychosis with a mood disorder. But at that point, I was sitting there like a mood disorder. In my mind, I'm like, okay, I probably have depression or something, or anxiety, or, I wasn't thinking bipolar. So I was like, okay, they're probably going to tell me I have like, some severe anxiety. And so while I was like waiting for them to give the diagnosis, I was like, getting different medication. They started off with like mood stabilizers and like lithium to get me to from that point, get me down to a baseline. And then while I was in the hospital, I was doing like different activities because they had like group therapies and like different sessions where it was like arts and crafts and stuff to try to get us to mingle with one another, I guess. But yeah, most of it was like trial and error in the beginning. And then when I got the diagnosis, they said, okay, here's what your diagnosis is. They gave me a packet. And to this day, I remember distinctly the nurse handed me a packet and she was like, this is your diagnosis. The doctor's confirmed. And if you have any questions, let us know. So I went back to my room with the packet and I saw on the top of it bipolar disorder. And I'm like, oh, okay. So this is like more than I thought it was going to be. But the thing that I don't really like about that moment is that I was by myself when that was going on.
Wait,
And
hold on.
like,
You found out you had bipolar because your packet was labeled that? No one had told you? They just left it in your hands and walked out the
yep,
room?
yeah.
Oh my God.
Yeah, so that's the thing that I was like, okay, this should have been explained to me. Then the next time I met with the
Yeah, I'll say so.
like, and then the next time I met with the doctor, they were like, okay, I assume that you received like your diagnosis. Do you have any questions or whatnot? And I'm like, so you expected me to sit down and read a packet and then come back
Oh
to
my
you with any
God.
questions that I had? Like, Yeah, it was wild. But
Yeah.
I think that goes to the point of like how much like these systems and these facilities, especially with like mental hospitals, they don't really have that many effective resources to actually get to the point where you feel like you're supported. Like it's just
Yeah.
like more of like a band-aid solution for the time being. And then they release you and let you know like, okay, here are the medications that you're taking. Here are some tips on how to manage the disorder. Because when I was being discharged, they gave me more like packets and information. And they were just like, okay, here's your medicine. Here are like some of the side effects. And, here are some helpful tips on how to manage bipolar disorder and everything. And they just gave that to my mom and I. And thankfully, I had my mom on the outside. Once I told her the diagnosis, she was researching and she was getting books. And she was like, okay, when you come out, this is what we're going to do. We're going to learn as much as we can. And so we did most of the learning outside of the general knowledge. We did that on our own. So it was like the hospital was just like a temporary thing to get me stabilized. And then they're like, okay, that's what you have. And here's the medication. And this is how you can treat it.
Wow. Okay. And then they send you home with all these packets, and then you start to do the work of learning how to live with this disease. What
Yep.
did that process look like?
So that process, I'm not going to lie, it was a little confusing because my first thought was, how am I going to go on with the rest of my life? Like, what does working with this look like? Like, do I have to find a new job? Or, like, I was just like, very confused about everything. But my mom, that's why I'm so grateful for my mom and my sister because they really stepped in and decided to learn a lot about it and also kind of monitor me. So they would be the ones to say, hey, Sarah, maybe you should go to bed a little earlier because, sleep is an important part. And, they would just be helping me through that process. And so it felt scary at first, but because I had a supportive community behind me, like even my friends, like some of them I told because I was in the hospital for like 3 weeks, so people weren't really hearing from me. And they were like, what happened? Like, are you okay? And so I explained to my friends what happened. And they were even just like, wow, like, let's help. Like, how could we help? Like, what could we do? And so I'm like, at first I was like, tell me if I'm talking too fast, like
Yeah.
if I'm talking to you, because like I need to know that it's not getting to that point again. And they were also helpful. Like sometimes, even to this day, they would send me articles and be like, hey, I found this article. I don't know what you think of it, but this might be helpful. So just having that community around me helped me to be able to adjust. And at first, I had to drink decaf coffee and everything because they said the caffeine like clashes with the medicine. Like, honestly, just get like a psychiatrist or build that support team to anybody who's listening because that was another thing that helped me, like getting the right psychiatrist, getting a good therapist who had experience in bipolar disorder, and just having that support team in addition to community helped me to be able to transition a lot better.
What ended up being your medication regimen? If you don't mind sharing specifics, I always think it's, for other people who have specific diseases, it can be nice to hear what individual people are doing. And is that something that developed over time, or did you just find the right med right away? Or did you have to try different ones until you figured out what would work for you?
Oh, it was definitely try different ones until
Okay.
it worked for me. Because like at first, it was lithium and Abilify. Those were the only two that I had. And they said that the Abilify was to help with like the psychosis elements of it. And the lithium was more for like mood stabilization. And even to this day, I take the lithium still because the lithium was helping me a lot more. The Abilify, however, that made my weight skyrocket. First of all, I gained a lot of weight. And then also, I was feeling like very numb with the Abilify. Like, I was also feeling like kind of like a zombie. I was like
Hmm.
feeling in a daze, and I was like, what is happening? Like, I don't really feel like myself. And it also took me to change psychiatrists in the beginning because the psychiatrist that I initially had, like after the hospital, he wasn't really like taking what I was saying seriously in terms of the side effects because I'm like, I feel numb. Like, I even got little tremors in my hand at one point, and I was like, this isn't really normal. And then he would say stuff like, oh, you just started it, it will taper out. And I'm like, okay, but I'm still feeling numb after a good month of being on this medicine. So what's going on?
Yeah.
And so I had to change my psychiatrist who was able to get me off of the Abilify and put me on Zolpidem, which was like a sleeping medication because I wasn't sleeping at night either, on top of that. And then she put me on sertraline, which was like an antidepressant because I was feeling low a lot more often in being on Abilify. So it was like a lot of like trial and error. It was like adjusting the dosages too. Like maybe it wasn't the medication itself, maybe the dosage was too high. So my new psychiatrist and I were just like, she was lowering it sometimes, then bringing it back up. And, really opening up that line of communication was super helpful because me telling her what was going on with me and she was able to like find a solution that best fit me so that I don't have to keep going through these side effects. So it was a lot of back and forth, and I was frustrated in the beginning because I'm like, oh, why do I have to try so many different medications? Like, why are we going back and forth? But she was able to also encourage me that this is a process and everybody looks different. And you don't have to get down on yourself because things aren't working out in the beginning. Like, you have to keep finding what works best for you.
And it sounds like while you're going through that, you're also having a crisis of faith. Can you tell me about that process?
Yes. So my crisis of faith came as soon as I got the diagnosis because my first thought was, God, what is happening? Like, how did I even get here? And even me being in the hospital at first, I was just more focused on, like, okay, how do I get out of here? Like, I wasn't even thinking about, like, the faith elements and everything at that point. But after I got that diagnosis, I was like, okay, God, I don't know what my future is going to look like. Why now? Like, even with me graduating during the pandemic and me trying to start my career, like, I'm just like, what is going on? And even in that moment of me questioning, I was still praying, like, God, I don't know what's happening, but can you be with me in this hospital? Because I'm very scared, very confused. Just don't leave me in this situation. And so after getting out of the hospital, I still had those moments where I was like, great, now I have to deal with this condition that is totally changing the rest of my life. Like, I have to change my entire lifestyle. Like, I have to set a bedtime like hours earlier than normal because I want to make sure I'm getting a good amount of sleep. I have to take these medications. My weight is fluctuating. Like, there was just a lot of things where I was like, God, now I have to deal with this. Why are you doing this? And being honest with God was really the catalyst for me actually trusting that there can be hope even with these situations. And as I was like praying to God and asking him why he was doing all of this and really having that community, and it goes back to that support system because I was asking my friends, I was asking mentors, like, how could God allow this to happen to me? Like, I'm going through a whirlwind, a crisis of faith. And they were able to encourage me and say that just because you are going through this type of condition doesn't mean that your faith in God is any less and that God loves you any less than he does now. And that is something that you don't grow up hearing,
Mm.
especially in church, especially in the Black community. Like, we don't really say that mental health is like not indicative of your faith or your accomplishments. We always think, well, if you're depressed, then you must be having a crisis of faith, or, something must be wrong if you're dealing with these things. But just learning how to put things in perspective and just saying that a mental health condition can almost be likened to a physical condition where it's like you have this condition that you need to manage, but that doesn't mean that you're a different person because you're going through that. Like, we don't say somebody who has a broken leg is any less of a person or they failed in their faith. We say, hey, I hope your leg gets better and I hope you're getting the treatment. So why can't we say that for mental health issues? And I think really understanding that you can have faith and mental health, that was really the difference for me, where I was like, I could still be a faith-based person and still go through my life and manage what I need to manage with my bipolar disorder. And I don't think they're mutually exclusive. Like, you could go to church and still take medication. You could read your Bible and still see a psychiatrist. Like, it's not one or the other. And so that really helped me to look into, okay, how can I use my faith to inform my mental health journey? And for me, that was looking at how I can strengthen my faith through like prayer, reading the Bible, and actually giving me that hope to be able to say, you know what, this sucks, but I'm going to move forward because I know that I have that hope to be able to keep living and to keep having my life just as like God intended for me to have, even if this bad thing has happened to me right now. And so I would like to encourage anybody listening that even if you're not like a religious person, just having that hope to keep you going through life's challenges is something that is really beneficial because the world is full of despair as it is already. Like, you don't need to overwhelm yourself with the burdens of, oh, am I going to get through this? Is this the end of my life? It's not the end. Like, you can still achieve great things even though you are dealing with the condition.
This is such an amazing message, and I'm so impressed. I mean, you went through this crucible in multiple ways that shook up the foundation of your life, and you came out of it with these really incredible conclusions that are so worth sharing. And it sounds like you then went about the work of sharing those conclusions. How long into this process? Because I mean, we're only talking about 4 years here. That's the other thing I keep thinking about is like, how did all of this happen in 4 years? Because you know, I have my own chronic illness journey and it's long. Just getting a diagnosis took decades. So just going from diagnosis to this point of now trying to help other people have hope so fast is very impressive. But how fast was it? I mean, how long ago did you start your podcast? When did you start becoming a public mental health advocate?
That's a great question. And I want to say this spanned a little bit longer than 4 years. Now that I look back at it, I would say that I was dealing with bipolar symptoms since high school, but I didn't know that those were bipolar symptoms.
That totally makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, it took that manic experience to really get it at the forefront where it's like, okay, there's something really significant happening. And I always put my mental health on the back burner because, like I said, it wasn't something that I was thinking about. It wasn't something that I actually wanted to, find out more about because I was so focused on school, going to college, living my life. And then right after I graduated, these things started happening. So it was really more of like, now that I look back at it and have that like perspective, it was really more of a lifelong almost journey up until this point.
That totally makes sense. I appreciate that for sure.
Yeah, of course. But with the podcast, that really came pretty quickly. So I started the podcast in November of 2021. And I know.
And your diagnosis was in January of 2021. Wow.
Yes. Because by the end of the month, I got released from the hospital by the end of January. And so going into like February, March, April, by May, I was like, okay, I'm trying to see, because that's when I got my new psychiatrist and everything. And so I felt a little bit better. And I'm like, oh my gosh, in reading up about this, more people should know about this. And so I originally wanted to do like a blog where I would write like like diary entries, like, okay, this is the life of a person who has bipolar disorder. And so I wanted to just write all that and put it out there and be like, hey, people need to know. Because after my experience in the hospital of not really getting that much information, and then me learning about it after I was discharged from the hospital, I was like, people need to know more about this because, especially if they have something similar to me, I would want more people to know so it doesn't have to get to a hospital experience, you know? So I was like, yeah, let me just write a bunch of blog posts, give a bunch of information, and put it out there. But then I was like pitching this idea to my friends. I'm like, what do you guys think? And they're like, you should speak about it. Like, you should actually talk. Like, one of my friends in particular, she was like, it's good to see something on the page and, write about it, but actually hearing you share your story could actually help more people because they're not only hearing your story, but they're hearing it straight from you and they're hearing your voice. So at that point, I was very hesitant because I was like, "Ooh, I do not like recordings. I don't like to hear myself on recordings." Like, even to this day, sometimes I'm editing my podcast episodes and I'm like, but eventually it came to a point where I was like recording voice notes instead of like doing the like writing out the journal entries. And it's like with recording the voice notes, I just kept them in the archive and I was like, okay, I'll keep them there. And then one of my other friends, she was starting a podcast and she was like, would you like to come on and share your experiences? And I'm like, I don't know, like, will people actually listen? But I went on, and while I was recording the podcast, I was like, oh, this is easy. Like, I'm just talking. So, so I just decided, like, okay, I'm gonna hit record and I'm just gonna do the first episode, which took multiple takes because I was trying to perfect it before I put it out there online. Um, but yeah, even like sharing about my bipolar disorder, that was difficult for me at first
Yeah.
because I was like, okay, a lot of people are going to hear this. Like maybe potential employers will hear this, friends and family who I didn't tell are going to hear this. And so I was very hesitant at first, but then I remembered how I felt while I was in the hospital. And just if I could go back to that moment and really educate myself on these things and probably catch the symptoms a lot earlier so it didn't have to escalate to that point, that's something I kept thinking about as I was starting the podcast. And I'm
Mm.
like, even if I help one person get the knowledge that they need to be able to make a difference in their life, then you know what? I'm going to tell my story. I'm going to put it out there. Whoever listens is whoever listens. And after that, after initially releasing the podcast and getting to connect with amazing people online like yourself who are actively just talking about mental health and having that community as well to show I'm not alone. Like that gave me the extra motivation to keep going because I realized that there are a lot of other people who also want to share their stories and raise awareness. And so there were a lot of different motivators to keep me going. And now it's just become a point where I'm building my own community through this podcast. I was also on the cover of Women Who Podcast magazine for my podcast.
Wow.
Like it's just come into its own thing. And I'm just so happy that people are able to find that hope and the mental health education that they need.
Yeah, that's so awesome, so powerful. And you've talked a couple times throughout this conversation about the stigma around mental health. And I love something you said about how mental health is just like any other chronic illness, you know? And I totally agree with that. That's been something that I've believed for many years. And it's through my own experience with my chronic illness. I have mast cell activation syndrome, and it can absolutely affect my mental state. You know, it is a flood of chemicals in my body from my own mast cells when it shouldn't be happening. And it can do all sorts of things to how I'm thinking and feeling. For years, I had this without knowing what it was. And it was just a mystery illness. And I would have these moments of like, what are these thoughts and feelings that are suddenly here that I don't feel that way, but I'm feeling it so intensely right now. And it felt symptomatic to me. And I started to think of it that way, like symptomatic thoughts and feelings that aren't me, that are happening in me because of some unseen process that I don't understand. And compartmentalizing it like that has been extremely helpful for me, because now when it happens, I can recognize it and ride through it, knowing that it is not going to linger. Because the problem with thoughts is that they seem like they're going to last forever, right?
Yes.
The problem with a negative thought, positive thoughts always feel fleeting, and it's stupid. It's so upsetting that that's how this works. But a negative thought is just like, I'm going to feel this for the rest of my life. And it takes practice and experience to recognize that that's not true. And that's something that's really powerful and helpful of public advocacy, like what you do, is talking about, when you first have your first manic episode at 20, well, maybe not the first, but the one that was serious enough to get you to the hospital at 21, I'll bet you that thought crossed your mind of, this is going to last forever. This is me forever,
Yeah.
And I don't know why our brains do that to us, but that's what they do. So for me, learning to think about symptomatic thoughts and learning to recognize that they are fleeting has been a transformational thing for me. I don't know. That's why I really feel like I recognize a lot of what you're talking about and empathize with it and have experienced it myself. And I think that it is super important for us to talk about these things. And yet there is a stigma, and there's a stigma around being chronically ill. And it's so your broken bone example is perfect. There's no stigma around breaking a bone, but there is a stigma about having a chronic illness. There is a stigma about having anything going on with your mental health. And it's unfair. But do you feel pushback from that sometimes in your public work? Do you get comments online that make you angry? Do people misunderstand you and judge you? And how do you push through those moments?
Yes, that is an excellent question. And funny enough, I love my church community. I just want to preface it before I say this, but I've gotten pushback from faith-based communities sometimes because I think the problem with that is we're still behind as a faith-based community in terms of recognizing that these are physical conditions. Like, your brain is a physical part of your body. And so a lot of the times in the church especially, we conflate spiritual with the physical. And so if you're having a physical problem, a lot of the times, especially if it's mental health, they say that, oh, maybe you should pray more. And I'm hearing this and I'm like, well, we're not negating prayer. We're just saying, hey, maybe you need to see a therapist. That's different. Like, you don't have to really pressure people into thinking that they're not doing enough in their spiritual life. So I've gotten a lot of questions, a lot of comments saying well, if you are a believer, why don't you believe in the power of healing? God could heal. And that would just get into a whole conversation of, okay, well, we are physical human beings, and we also live in a world where we get sick. And when people ask those questions, I'm just like, okay, think of a headache, right? If you're a Christian, you still experience headaches, right? You still get sick, you still get the flu. So you're not exempt from feeling these things. And so a lot of the times where people are like, don't you believe in absolute healing? It's like, well, yes, I believe God can do miracles, but at the same time, he's not going to stop me from tripping or having a headache or getting the flu all the time, because I'm a human being and these things happen in the world. So when I hear things like, okay, maybe people need to just start praying or break out the oil when these things are going on, it's like they are going through something that's normal. It's not alien to have a chronic illness. It's not alien to have a mental health condition. Yes, it's not ideal. Yes, if I could give up my bipolar disorder in a heartbeat, I definitely would. But I have to realize that I'm also a human being going through a very human experience. Like, we all get sick, we all have illnesses, we all have things to contend with. And so it doesn't make me a bad person when I'm going through this. It just means that my body is going through something that I need to manage. And yeah, so I get like a lot of like different questions like from faith-based communities. And again, we have a lot of work to do in terms of like bringing it to there. But another community, and I'm speaking from personal experience as a Black woman, the Black community is another area that gets a lot of pushback in terms of like mental health. And that goes into a lot of stigmatization, but also racial tensions and, systematic racism when it comes to the medical system and how, we're often treated in that area. And so a lot of the times you find that in me talking about these things, a lot of my peers are like, okay, you went to therapy, but I don't know, therapy's not for me. And I'm glad it worked for you, but it's not going to work for me. They're not going to understand me. And I think this also comes from the aspect of having cultural competence in the medical field and also, especially in the psychological field, with like therapists and psychiatrists, having a psychiatrist, and I could say from personal experience, having a therapist who understands my cultural background and just different things that I would find like, skeptical, like, oh, do I have to take this medication? Like, what's going on? Like, my psychiatrist is able to break it down to a point where she's like, listen, I know what you're thinking. I know how you feel. It's okay. Like, this is what you need. And so having somebody who has that cultural background as well makes a huge difference. But saying all of that to say, I get the most pushback from my own community and also like sometimes the faith-based community and just trying to understand the balance of having faith, having mental health, and just using your faith to fuel that hope for you to continue in your mental health journey. Like, that's what I try to bring with the podcast, but it does get muddled sometimes in those communities.
Wow. Yeah. And what an amazing message. And you're just experiencing your own truth and recognizing that it might not be in line with what you've been taught and that has been a problem for you. So you want to share the truth and you keep trying to push that message out. And that's brave. And I really commend you for that. I think that's incredibly powerful and important work. And,
Thank you.
yeah, thank you for doing it. That's so awesome. Well, I have one more question for you, and you've already alluded to this, so I'm excited to ask it. My favorite last question to ask is if you could go back in time and bring a message to yourself in the past based off of what you've learned from your own journey, what would it be? And for you, you've already said you were thinking about this. You were thinking about yourself in the hospital when those doctors just threw you a pamphlet that changed your life without saying a word about it, which is I'm still laughing about.
Yeah.
In that moment, if you had the ability to hop in a time machine and jump back to that moment so you could be there to talk to yourself, what is the message that you would have shared?
That is an excellent question. And I would say that your diagnosis does not define who you are. And that was the first thought that came to my head in that moment. Like, I thought me having bipolar disorder was going to be the end of my life and who I am as a person. And I would say to myself that you can learn more about this so that way you can treat it. You can learn more. And that's something I didn't think I could. I thought, okay, this is it. This is the diagnosis, like no other information. But I would say to myself that you don't need to feel like you're less than just because you have this condition. And I would also tell myself that you're not alone. Like, you're going to come to find out through this podcast that there are a lot of people just like you who are open about sharing their experiences and actually bringing education to people. So don't feel like you're a failure because you have this, because you're not. And the last thing that I would say to myself is, even if you receive pushback, people need to hear your story. And that's something that I didn't think at first. Like, I thought, oh, no one would want to hear this. Like, no one needs this. Like, I don't know what to do with this. But people need to hear your story and people need to be encouraged and know that they can make it through this because you were also able to get through a lot of it. And even though you're going to have moments where you feel like it's pointless, you can still do this and you're going to touch a lot of lives and bring hope to a lot of people.
Wow. You've done a remarkable job on the podcast today. You're such a warrior, and you're on the front lines fighting this good fight, changing minds and bringing people hope. And what else could you ask of someone? That's so powerful. And it sounds like you have this really amazing future ahead of you as well. And I just thought of a question that I did want to ask you. So I'm going to make myself a liar and ask you another question. What is the current status of bipolar in your life? Do you feel like it is under control? And do you feel like you have begun the process of integrating it in the best way possible into your life?
Oh, that's an excellent question as well. So, at this point in my life, yes, I feel like I've reached a point of stability where I can be able to recognize when I'm about to go into either end of like the depression and the mania and be able to use the skills that I've learned through therapy and also to call my psychiatrist if anything is out of the ordinary. So I think I'm at a place in my life where I'm able to recognize when things might go awry, and I'm also able to keep that level of stability, which is not easy, I might add. Like, there are some days where I'm like, you know what, I'm done. Like, I don't want to do this anymore. So it's just really having a balance to know that there are going to be days where I'm not going to feel my best, but those don't have to last forever, like we were talking about before. So I'm so grateful to be able to be in this place in my life where I now can recognize, like, okay, I know what I need to do to be able to keep moving. And that's the most important thing.
Yeah, amazing. I'm so glad I remembered to ask that, because just that being your answer is going to give someone else hope, because that means that it's possible. You've done it only 4 years in, as far as having the diagnosis. So that's a really powerful message to wrap up on. Sarah, please tell people where we can go to connect with you online, find your podcast, or anything else you'd like to plug.
Yes, so I have my main podcast website, roughedgespodcast.com, and I also have a shop, which is roughedgespodcast.com/shop, and I also am on social media. On Instagram, I am rough.edges.podcast, and with YouTube and TikTok, it's the same handle, Rough Edges with Sarah.
Awesome. Well, Sarah, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today. Your openness in discussing bipolar is critically important, and just such a joy to hear your story today, to get to know you a little bit. I really appreciate you coming on the show.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Major Pain. I'm Jesse Mercury, the creator of this podcast, with support from Trisha Schmidt and Casey McKenzie. Artwork by Egg Salad Salad. Our theme music is the song Time Machine from my synthpop album Sci-Fi, now streaming everywhere. Join our community on social media, TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, and Facebook, all at Major Pain Podcast. If you have questions or comments you'd like to share with myself, our guests, or our listeners, send an email to majorpainpodcast@gmail.com. You can also head to our website to learn more about this show, support its creation, or leave a comment on any episode at majorpainpodcast.com. Major Pain is supported by our listeners on Patreon. Thank you to our $2 per month supporters, our $7 per month patrons Naomi Adele Smith, Sonny Roberts, Kelsey Matson, Alexandria Henderson, Justin Minnick, Laura Stevens, Heather Muncie, and Robert, and our $25 per month producers Steve Kavanaugh, Chris Fowler, Trish O'Brien, and Hipster Leia. Learn how you can support this podcast while receiving special recognition on the show, gifts, and monthly bonus episodes at patreon.com/majorpainpodcasts.